Technology brings with it a huge bunch of opportunities, but it also has a dark side, and that is the cybercrime and all these weird and wonderful things people get up to. And I'm joined today by Teri Solomon, who heads up the FINPRO division at Marsh Africa, to talk about how applicable is this in the real world for pension funds and administrators and trustees. So, Teri, welcome to the studio. Love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to chat to you. So yeah, the cyber risk threat landscape for retirement funds is indeed a definite cause for concern, and it is undeniably growing, and something that trustees need to pay more attention to, as well as I think our regulator needs to pay a little bit more attention. It's becoming an increasingly complex subject, of course, as members want to demand more online access to their data. And of course, as the funds and the third-party service providers also want to digitize their business. So the complexity further increases the risk around system vulnerabilities, and security breaches. So I think we often ask the question, well, why retirement funds? And of course, in the South African context, we've got a bit of a different industry. So of course, self-administered funds, no question, they own and operate their own computer systems, and therefore they need to take heed from a cybersecurity perspective. And that's not to say that non-self-administered funds, in other words, third-party administered funds, don't need to take heed, because they certainly do, albeit a lot of that risk does sit with the third-party service provider. But I think particularly referencing retirement funds and why they're so vulnerable is not only because of the volume of the data, but it's the kind of data that moves between retirement funds around, the sensitive nature of the data, the personal information, very much considered personal information in terms of POPI. And that kind of data is exactly what the hackers and the threat actors love to get their hands on. Also, the third-party service provider, or the supply chain risk, as we're calling it now. So, the vulnerabilities on third-party service providers' systems, where that information is flowing, exactly what the hackers love to do through their various mechanisms. And finally, members' rights under POPIA, which are now being increasingly recognized. So members are entitled to know where their data is going to be stored, how it's going to be stored, who it's going to be shared with, how that data is going to be accessed. So that's why retirement funds, I think, are particularly are at risk. If we look at the kind of main risks I'm often asked, it really is around ransomware. So that's encrypting the member data and then not allowing either the self-administered funds or, of course, the third-party service provider, the administrator, access to that data without a ransomware. And that typically globally is what we're seeing the biggest threat in retirement funds. And the other one is actual theft of data. So that's stealing the data for then use later on in other crimes. So for example, impersonation, fraud. And common areas of vulnerability continue to be things like the employer's website, obviously the employer's email, so spoofing as an example is a good technique, or phishing techniques using the employer's email. And then the third-party portals, so the administrator portal, where of course, you want to get access to your investment statement or your benefit statement, etc., etc. So those are the common areas of vulnerability. But I think, Chris, what's absolutely critical is for boards to understand the consequences of a loss. If there is a data loss, if there is a theft of member data, or as I say, the data is compromised. So obviously, not only are the threat actors targeting the data, but that may well lead to then loss of fund assets. And that's really when we enter into the realm of huge problems. That will follow a regulatory inquiry, and there could be regulatory investigation costs, fines and penalties, enforcement orders, and the like. There could well be legal liability on the fund, or civil liability, so damages as a result of a cyber breach. The cost, and here we're talking about costs of repairing the system, either the third-party service provider system or the self-administered fund system. Forensic investigations to determine the cause and the quantum. So how did the breach happen? Did it happen at the pension fund itself or the retirement fund, or did it happen at the third-party service provider? The legal costs, the PR costs, because the reputational damage is obviously massive. You can imagine your life savings sitting in a fund there's a data breach, your data is compromised. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want my money sitting in that fund any longer. So that's the issue. And then, of course, the member notification costs in terms of POPI. Finally, the personal liability for the trustees. Let's not for one moment forget that the liability on the trustees ultimately rests on the board. And I do believe that a time has come from a governance perspective and a board structure perspective to have technical competency on the board now from an IT perspective. The time has come. There's no question about that. But the personal liability for the trustees resulting from claims alleging breach of fiduciary duty, alleging breach of trust, non-disclosure, misleading disclosure around the data security of members' information, and of course allegations of breach of law. So I think that's all pretty obvious that, trustees, it is absolutely incumbent on them to manage and mitigate this data and this cyber exposure, and they can do that in a number of forms. But in the main, they should be considering risk assessments from initial stage all the way through to payment of a claim and how that data flows. So, what does that data look like? How does the data flow? From whom does the data flow? From the employer company through to the administrator, to the member, etc., etc. So that data flow is absolutely essential. Identify the threats, both internal and external. What are the threats that could happen along the way when the data is moving, the likelihood of the threats and the impact of the threats. That's very important. They then have to identify the controls in place. Again, internal and external controls. So, here we talk about different scenarios and how those controls would respond. So we're talking multi-factor authentication. What firewalls are in place? What antivirus is in place? Have they done penetration testing, etc., etc.? What would the controls look like in the event of simple loss of data, in the event of a trustee's personal Gmail being hacked, in the event of the trustee's laptop being stolen, right? In the event of a hard copy document being stolen or lost, what does that look like? What does it look like if there's improper admin access? So somebody hacks the administrator's portal, as an example, and so on and so forth. So once they've identified those controls in place, they then need to also look at the third-party service providers from a contractual perspective. Are they limiting liability? Never allow them to limit liability specifically for cyber. Critical is to assess the third-party service providers' cyber insurance. So what does that look like? Don't just take it on face value that they may have 150 or 200 million rand limit. What does their policy cover? Is their ransomware sublimited, as an example? Do they have co-insurance on their ransomware? So these are things that they need to do a little bit of a deeper dive, and I think it has become incumbent on the trustees as part of their duties of risk management and mitigation, of data security, to ask these kind of questions as well. And then I think finally, Chris, what's absolutely critical is that the board has to ensure that they have a very robust response plan, an emergency response plan. Who's going to say what in the event that there's a data breach? What is the communication strategy going to look like? Who are the advisors going to be? From a legal, from a compliance perspective, from a technical perspective, what is the regulatory and legal environment going to look like? So that robust plan is absolutely critical. And, we always say, don't wait until it happens. And everybody's running around like headless chickens, because having been involved in some of these data claims, unless you have an emergency response plan or an incident response plan where everybody knows their place and knows what to do, things can go horribly wrong. And then I think finally, Chris, on the insurance, and I know that Camargue underwriting managers are doing a presentation for the conference on the cover, on the trustees liability cover, but just from a cyber perspective, many of the attendees at the conference will know that Marsh a number of years ago introduced the data protection extension, which really was an endorsement to the trustee liability wording, and it was aimed to provide cover for data breaches, for cyber breaches, etc., etc. You might recall at the time that we started with a limit of 500,000 Rand. That's all that we could get the markets comfortable with. We progressed over the years to a limit of 5 million Rand, which is better, but it was still sublimited. we've also had ongoing discussions with Camargue around finding a way to incorporate that coverage into the main body of the wording. And the reason is really a technical discussion around, definitions not aligning to the endorsement and the main body of the wording. It didn't flow, the language didn't flow. The wording, the data protection extension is a Lloyd's agreed wording, whereas our wording is a Marsh agreed wording. And so there were a number of anomalies from a technical perspective where, again, we've had ongoing discussions with Camargue. And finally, Camargue actually didn't want the data protection extension because they have to secure separate reinsurance for that. So there's a cost to them, to do that. And so after many months of discussion and negotiation and legal opinions going backwards and forwards, what we've agreed in principle with Camargue, and we're really just dotting the T's, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, is that finally, and I think trustees are going to be very happy with this because this is the solution they've been asking for, is we're going to take the cover that's provided under the data protection extension, in other words, loss to the fund, and including damages and legal costs and regulatory proceedings arising out of a data breach, or a cyber event as defined. Also, very importantly, covering those crisis management costs. So covering the member notification costs, the emergency response costs in the event that there is a data breach. And we're building that into the main body of the wording, meaning that we will now have full limits coverage for cyber breaches, which I think is absolutely critical, no more sublimit. We also will have no excess. At the moment, it's 10,000 Rand excess, but we'll have no excess, which I think, again, is very, very important, meaning the policy will respond from the first Rand of cost. And equally important that the trustees will have peace of mind, that in the event that they are sued for what we call a wrongful act under the policy, resulting from a cyber breach or a cyber incident, that the policy will respond. Again, full limit. So it's broader cover, and it's exactly what the trustees have been asking us. We want more cyber cover. And so I think we found a really good solution to that. At this stage, it does look like it's going to come at a slight cost, and we're talking around possibly 5% premium increase. In other words, you'll do away with the cost of the data protection extension, but you'll pay an additional 5% premium, which I think is really, in the bigger scheme of things, a great solution and a great outcome. So, as I say, we're busy finalizing that. We're really hoping that within the next month, everything will be signed off. And then as and when our clients' funds come up for renewal, they will then enjoy, the full data protection or the full cyber liability insurance that they've been asking for, because the nature of the risk is growing in complexity. I honestly say it's not a question of, if it's going to happen, but when it's going to happen to a fund, and we need to be properly prepared. So, yeah, it's a growing exposure. I did say, and I'll say it again, I think the time has come for trustees to have an expert on the board from an IT perspective and a technical perspective. This risk is not going to dissipate anytime soon, but hopefully we're doing our part as well to help at least transfer the risk, albeit also managing and mitigating exposure.
100%. Yeah, I think thanks for that perspective. I don't think it's something that many people think about all that often. And, as technology progresses, it becomes, we're on this exponential curve. So does the ability to commit all these weird and wonderful things that your cyber criminals and people get up to. So I think very informative. Thank you very much. Really looking forward to hearing the outcome of your current discussions, and also just taking this up with you guys going forward. So thanks for your time. Really appreciate it, and good luck. We'll chat again soon.
Only a pleasure. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for your time.
100%. Take care.